Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome. My name is Claire Malloy. I work here as the assistant curator, and I'm one of the many co-curators for the group exhibition next year, which will be exploring the topics of caring, repairing, and healing. My pronouns are she, her. We'd like to invite you to keep your mask on for the next 45 minutes, which is a reading and conversation with Johanna Hedver. To give a little introduction to Johanna, their pronouns are they, them. Johanna is a Korean-American musician, artist, writer, raised by a family of witches in LA and based between LA and Berlin today. Perhaps you know, like me, Johanna Hedver's writing for including the text Minerva, The Miscarriage of the Brain, which was published in 2020, which is a collection of poems, performances, and essays. Or perhaps her novel, On Hell, which came into the world in 2018. Currently, you can see their work Glut, A Superabundance of Nothing, which is on view at the HKV until the 21st of November. And this year, on the 1st of January 2021, their album came out, Black Moon Lilith in Pisces in the 4th house. If you haven't heard it yet, it is a doom metal vocal guitar performance, and you need it in your life. But the first text that I read by Johanna Hedver was actually Sick Woman Theory, which came out in 2016. It's been translated into a plethora of languages, and it's our starting point today. You may have noticed that on your seat is a cute little green card and a pen. If you're sitting on one of the cubes behind, you're welcome to take one of the pens and the papers. These are for your questions. We realize that in an architecture like this, sometimes it can be hard to be close to your voice, so you're very welcome to use the written word. At the end of Johanna's reading, the cards will be collected and we'll be addressing some of your questions. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome Johanna here today to present to us a new piece of writing. Johanna, over to you. Welcome.
Hello. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you all for coming. This is the first time I've done an in real life reading in probably 2.5 or 3 years. I'm excited. I'm going to read something that has not been published yet, that is in progress. And I've been working on it in the last few weeks. And it was catalyzed by my realization that I've spent the majority of my time this year getting into email fights with institutions about disability access. So I started to write my bitterness and rage and frustration into a text, and I'm going to read it for you now. The working title is Why It's Taking So Long. Okay, here we go. Number 1. In January 2016, I published an essay that was my first attempt at thinking through the politics of chronic illness and disability. For the 6 years before that, I had become disabled by way of an injury and the onset and diagnoses of several chronic illnesses, some inherited. My text was called Sick Woman Theory because I realized that despite not identifying as a woman and before any of my other identities or occupations, that's how I was now seen. I realized that no matter what I said, did, produced, or defined myself as, I was now defined by society in terms of the care I needed, and that this is true for anyone defined by care, whether they gave it or took it, and that this was a raw fucking deal. I was seen as malingering, a burden, a drain on resources, possibly faking it, and certainly hysterical, simply because I had a body that needed more than it was supposed to need. I realized that the most common and universalizing condition of life, that our bodies get sick, need rest, need support, that they need at all, had been twisted into the measure of one's individual failure, something to be ashamed of and sorry for and kept out of sight until it passed and things could return to normal. I began writing on December 18th, 2014, in a flare, lying in bed. Over the next year, the essay was rejected by over a dozen publications and some of the biggest names in feminism before finding a home in Mask magazine, which was ad-free, online, and run by a volunteer group of anti-capitalists in their 20s. I was paid $81, the highest amount that Mask paid its writers. Because there were no ads, no one made any money as that essay went on to become one of Mask's most viewed, with hundreds of thousands of clicks. It has since been translated into 10 languages, included in anthologies published by prestigious presses, one of which was edited by a person who had originally rejected it, and quoted, cited, and taught widely. In the 5 years since Sick Woman Theory landed, I have found myself in the peculiar position of being a sort of spokesperson for the disabled and chronically ill community. Within a week of its publication, I started to receive invitations to speak and write on the topics of care, illness, disability, and ableism. I remember being invited to give a reading in Oakland. And when I said I'd like to read some of my poetry, the organizers shouted into the Skype call, "No, we want you to read Sick Woman Theory." Editors from publishing houses large and small asked if they could buy the Sick Woman Theory book. And when I said I hadn't written it yet, but I did have 2 finished novels, a collection of poetry and essays, and another novel in the works, and would they be interested in those, which of course they were not, I learned the first of many lessons about exactly how the insidious twins of visibility and cultural capital work. It was not lost on me that I, who passed as abled, white, and cis, was being invited into places that other disabled artists and activists who did not pass were not. I felt like an underground band who has an unexpected hit on the radio. I'd been working as an artist for over a decade at that point and publishing my writing since 2001 when I was 17. And I tried to suggest that I had other songs, even whole albums that might be worth listening to, but mostly the crowd just wanted me to play my one hit. In short, they saw the sick woman, not me. Most of my friends were puzzled as to why I complained about Sick Woman Theory so much. Some wondered why I didn't cash in on my tiny moment. Even a small book deal would have been twice what I made in a year. And wasn't this what every writer hopes for? To write a piece that lands with people, that even if only a little changes the public conversation? The only way I can explain my disquiet is to say that what changed was not what needed to change. When I wrote Sick Woman Theory, I was writing into the totalizing climate of ableism, which at best renders invisible anyone who deviates from its invented norm, and at worst kills them outright. I was writing into the institutional practices of gaslighting, discrimination, brutality, incarceration, eugenics. I was broiling with rage. I wanted scorched earth. When I say I wrote into rather than about, I mean that I couldn't see another way to make my case, but to go deep into the shit so I could report back on its exact and specific qualities, which means that I got covered in shit. I summoned a voice, zealous, galvanized, grandiose, that was not how my own sounded at the time. And I did this because I needed a voice like that, to rally, to cut a path through, to shout, "Is anyone there?" into the lonesome dark and maybe hear back a, "Here we are." I needed to bellow, "Follow me," just to give myself a direction, a path, somewhere to go that was not where I was. But when it started getting into the water supply, I saw that this voice was its own cruel optimism, a promise that could never deliver. What I had conjured up was a sick woman that seemed empowering and righteous and who promised a community. But what I quickly learned is that no promise of community can hold. All promises of solidarity fail. Anyone who's worked in activism for longer than 5 minutes knows this, because the promise is not enough. If there is not actual material change that comes with it, a promise is just hot air. And worse, it's hot air that puffs up around an individual, a heroic leader, leaving everyone else in the dust. What I mean is, what I wanted Sick Woman Theory to change was the world, but it only ended up changing me. Here's another way I can explain it. One morning, I opened my Instagram to see that I'd been tagged in a photo by someone I didn't know. The photo was from a tattoo account, the torso of someone, head cut off, a large, fresh tattoo on their upper arm and shoulder. It was an illustration of a person in a frame like a tarot card. I frowned and squinted, not seeing why I'd be tagged in this. I had to stare at it for a minute before I saw that it was an illustration of me, based on one of the portraits that accompanied the Sick Woman Theory text, where I'm lying in bed with my hair fanned out on the pillow like the ink cloud of a frightened octopus. The second I recognized myself tattooed on this stranger's arm, my nose exploded with blood and wouldn't stop for 45 minutes. I know I am being contradictory, asking for too much. I both wanted Sick Woman Theory to change the world, and I'd prefer that it not make such a fuss about its author. I wanted to articulate my experiences with chronic pain and poverty, the medical industrial complex, the gaslighting from doctors, but I did not want to be cast in a romantic face-off with my tragic lot, my fate worse than death. I wanted to describe the figure of the sick woman so I could explain in detail why she shouldn't exist. But I also wanted those who would identify with her not to feel that their suffering was unseen and worthless. I wanted to write a manifesto, but I learned that a manifesto is only ever a document that reaches too far, that speculates too impossibly, and that the only use a manifesto can have is to lay bare its unmanifestation. Number 2. About 6 months into the sick woman's storm, I started making a list of accessibility requirements that I would need if I was going to work with institutions, so they could host my disabled ass and make the event accessible for the audience. The document began as a necessity. I had to put into emails that if I was to stay overnight for an event, I'd need to sleep in my own bed in an actual room and not on an air mattress in an unheated hallway because bitches tried it. I had to write that the venue hosting the disability conference had to be wheelchair accessible because bitches, so many, tried it. I had to insist that all access info listing both the ways that the event was and was not accessible be posted with the announcement because institutions love to say how they've made their event accessible, but would prefer not to include the inaccessible bits, which are, of course, the bits that the disabled community actually needs. After personally using this document for several years and sharing it with friends as a template upon which they could build their own, and then hearing that both disabled artists and institutions working with them had found it useful, I published my Disability Access Rider on Tumblr. Within a few days, I saw some tweets go around that said essentially, if I used a document like this, I'd never get invited anywhere. Bitch, same. It seems that some are under the impression that I send that document and it just works. Very quickly, my Disability Access Rider became a document of failure. I learned that institutions had often never seen a document like this before, nor had they given any thought to access at all. And so I decided to grade on improvement, rather than using my rider punitively. In response to an invitation, I'd send it and ask if we could have a conversation about how they could or could not support each item. I'd say that I hoped this document could open space for us to work on access together, which means that it's an itemized list of all the things I'm going to have to pour uncompensated educational labor into, and more often than not be told that the institution cannot support them. The reasons they cannot support them are myriad. I've heard everything from the more understandable, we don't have a budget for that, to the less, but I find sign language distracting. I'm not sure if this policy of grading on improvement has been a good idea. I did it because it was more realistic than expecting accessibility to already be there. But in reality, it's meant that I spend most of my time writing emails that explain why live captioning is important to have at a lecture, and then getting into email fights about it. It's meant that I cannot just say, I need an aisle seat on the flight, but I need an aisle seat on the flight because I use a cane. And even if I do bring my cane into the discussion, I've often boarded flights and found myself booked in a middle or window seat. And when I alert the institution to this, they tell me that at the airport they are sure you can advocate for yourself. But I want to say, I thought I already did. Grading on improvement has meant that the costs of the institution's improvements have been borne by me for free. At best, it has meant that I've served as a learning experience I did not particularly want to be. And worse, I have been ignored, argued with, chastised for being difficult, and disinvited because of that document. And if the organizers are white women, fuck me. There will be obsequious apologies, testimonies of guilt, lots of emails about how they are so very overworked and trying so very hard, and of course, tears. Recently, I made a rule for myself. If an invitation comes in for anything about care, and it's organized by only white women, it's an automatic no. It says something that any event you've seen me participate in since 2016 was one of the few where the access conditions were tolerable, and nearly all of these events were inaccessible in some way, and only one had secured and budgeted for comprehensive accessibility features before inviting me. But this is the only part of my public role as the sick woman that feels like it is worth anything, because it's not some chip I can cash in for my ego, but something that might make meaningful change and bring actual support to the disabled community, that I would be leveraged as a virtue signal that the institution can hold up to make itself look good, is the game being played, and for better or worse, I sometimes choose to play it. I know I can't win, but it seems better than not playing at all. At least while I'm here, I can try to do what I can. But what I've learned is this is so much easier said than done. It's like saying that all it takes to colonize Mars is not a team of people working around the clock on the hardest problem in the world with billions of dollars stolen through exploitative labor practices, but a white guy with a vision. And in this analogy, yeah, I guess I'm Elon. Speaking of heroic leaders that leave everyone else in the dust, I've found that as my cultural capital has increased, if I insist on certain accessibility requirements, not in the name of the audience who might need them, but for myself, I am more likely to get them. This is because riders are traditionally used by divas and rock stars, and this is an economy that institutions understand. The economy of idiosyncratic spectacle, of throwing one's weight around, of power. A Crip friend put it well. They seem to think access is the same as wanting my name in lowercase letters. I have adapted to this, joking that access is a kind of diva solidarity, that we Crips should approach it as supporting each other to be divas. But this is limited comfort. If access is seen as one individual's special needs or accommodations, it can be separated from the structural inaccessibility of the world that necessitates it. It scales disability down to the quirk of a single person's body, something to be dismissed as an inconvenience or an extravagance to be indulged. I know that most venues I've worked with only ever made events accessible because of me, and because the moment my rider was taken off the table, sorry, I get emotional about this. The moment my rider was taken off the table, the moment I wasn't there to make my demands, everything went back to how it was before. And am I really being a diva when I'm asking for a wheelchair ramp? One response I've gotten to my access rider is that the institution did not budget for accessibility, but one or a few of the organizers who care enough will personally try to make it work, putting in extra hours of their own unpaid labor. For one music festival I performed at, the person who took my rider seriously was the only woman of color on staff. She said she understood why disability access was important, but said to me that it felt like I was dumping all this extra work on her. I nodded. That's exactly what this document is about, I said. My disability access rider is not a list of things that we can achieve together if only we put our minds to it. If only that were true. I'm not asking the staff of an institution to be more overworked, stressed out, and underpaid in working against ableism. I'm trying to point out that they already are. I'm trying to point out that the most fucked up conditions of capitalism exist because of ableism, and so we should help each other out with this. My rider is a way to acknowledge that structural inequality and exploitation exist, that ableism infects all ideologies of oppression, that capitalism cannot work without it, and so we can't fight it alone. Making events accessible takes an impossible amount of labor, money, and time. It is not something to which the word achieved can even be applied. And ultimately, perfect access is impossible. It doesn't exist. In practice, it's a goddamn mess. Hiring signers for an event of 2 hours costs hundreds of dollars. Live captioners are booked out months in advance because they're so scarce, and so many buildings have fucking stairs. The world is inaccessible. The ideology of ableism is everywhere in everything, from urban planning to legal policy to wealth inequality to the super cripple myth to the word lame being used in casual conversation about things that suck. And this is why I'm asking that we bear it together. I tried to explain to this woman that care is always a deficit. Access is always insolvent, and that's the point. This is because the body, by definition, is a thing that needs support. It needs food, rest, sleep, shelter, care. And I like to truncate this definition to make the body simply a thing that needs, period. Because what else would support be, if not needed? The body's dependency is its ontology. It cannot survive alone unto itself, even if it wanted to. And yet we've been taught that such dependencies, such needs, are abnormal, disgraceful, an index of one's inadequacy. Capitalism and its attendant ideologies have used powerful magic to make us believe the opposite of what is true. They have persuaded us that the most important force on earth is one's individual will and the ability to manifest it, regardless of what that would require in terms of material resources. They have convinced us that any one person's success is the simple result of a decision they made to thrive, and not because of the support any individual requires to do anything on every level, from the earthly, the familial, the social, economic, political. They have induced us to think that the failure to lead a life of wealth, ease, comfort, and privilege is because that person just couldn't get it together, couldn't pull themselves up by their bootstraps, wasn't willing to put in the work. The magic trick capitalism has managed to pull off is not only to make us believe that we do not need, but that we should not. Disability access is about orienting time to a scale that prioritizes what we need and whom we support, which is in direct opposition to the capitalist scale of time that ignores and devalues such things. And this is why access takes so many resources, so much energy and labor, and why, of course, it can never be perfect. The body is never going to be solvent. It's always going to need too much, be too expensive, not do everything we want it to, hurt more than we can bear, and then decline until it can no longer move. My access rider is not about sharing the load so that we can suddenly be in the black. It's about redefining what being in the red means, what being dependent on each other does, and how we are already there and always in it. When care is framed within the context of debt, when my giving care to you means I'm depleting my own stash, and your taking from me means that you now owe me, the omnipresence of our need is framed as a kind of weird bankruptcy that happens only to the weak, which is bonkers. The logic of capitalism states that the person who needs support from society is a burden on that society, but this logic can only work when the premise holds that our natural state is one of surplus, and it is not. Yes, it might be nice to labor without limits, survive without support, live without loss, decline, and fatigue, but that's not how it is. If we should have learned anything from the COVID pandemic, it's that for better, and most certainly for worse, we're in this together. Obviously, I would prefer the conversation about access to be about real shit, like universal health care, a living wage, and abolishing the police. But I have to start where I am, with what is within reach. So for now, all gender bathrooms and ramps and alt text will have to do. But what I'm trying to smuggle in with my gentle but determined requests is the more radical proposal of total institutional change, a restructuring on a systemic level of our values and the resources we allot to them, the power imbalance scrutinized and remade. I want accessibility to be seen as the political movement it is, advocating for the rights of a group that hardly has any and needs them the most. I want ableism understood as the most integral component of all oppressive ideologies: capitalism, white supremacy, sexism, misogyny, homo and transphobia, classism, colonialism, that these all feed off each other, that they need each other to work, and what they need most of all is ableism, because it's the ideology that most sweepingly invents the false hierarchy of that which can be deemed normal, which is to say, who can be deemed not normal. I don't want accessibility because the disabled community deserves it, because we've proven ourselves worthy, allowed into the category of the good and legitimate human by those who would decide and define it. I don't want accessibility because someone is being generous in giving it to me, nor do I want the labor I have committed to accessibility to be framed in terms of my own generosity, that I'm insisting we have a bench to sit on in the museum out of the goodness of my heart. I know I sound bitter and cranky, but what else should I be? Fucking grateful for the opportunity, focusing on the silver lining, appreciative of all that I've learned from the pain of this struggle. You'll have to forgive me, but when an institution comes at me talking about care, repair, and healing, I don't buy it. Hands down, the best thing that happened to me because of Sick Woman Theory was that other Crips read it and came and got me. When I had shouted, I get so emotional about this because I didn't have these people in my life when I read it, when I first wrote it and read it out into a public like right now. And that was a much worse condition than it is now. So when I had shouted, "Is anyone there?" into that lonesome dark, they were like, "Yes, bitch, and we're waiting for you." Because of this text, I am now part of an actual Crip fam. Friends who have my back as I have theirs, friends who get it, who are just as tired as I am, and who know that, yes, we are fighting for our very lives, and it's going to take all we have. So let's hunker down and make a plan for the long haul. We're not going anywhere. If the future is anything, it's disabled. And that is true for everyone. And if you don't believe me, just wait. Some might assume that my great tragedy in my life is my illness. But in my opinion, the far greater tragedy is that I can, for whatever reason, write about it pretty well. I once went to an astrologer who pointed a long finger at my chart and said, "Your illness is more dignified than your life." I sat back and sighed. "I fucking knew it," I said. In astrology, the word dignified means that a planet is supported to do what it wants to do. But the connotations of an elegant seriousness also apply. I can see my illness out in front, distinguished, noble, and me and my little life behind it. I can see that this is what you see too. So while I have your attention, let me ask that you try to zoom out, to see the many systems and structures, dependencies and entanglements, invisible and not, that have brought me here and that will determine where I go. And let me ask you to see that these, whether you'd like it or not, for better and most certainly for worse, are all tangled up with you too. Thank you.
Wow.
I'm going to blame the crying on the Scorpio season. Sorry.
Wow, I would be more prone to blame the crying on the situation. And the line that struck me most starkly, well, there were two. The first one is, "I am broiling with rage,"
Yes.
which I find completely justified and the right temperature. Broiling, absolutely bubbling with rage. And the other one was, when an institution comes at me talking about caring, repairing, healing, I don't buy it. Thank you for writing that. I think that's absolutely urgent as we move towards this exhibition next year. And I just wanted to start with talking about the title of this talk, Nothing Heals. You talked a lot in your text about the concept of care, but let's go to healing. What is your big problem with healing?
Yes, I just think that it's just not. I think that there is more often than an actual effective healing, I think it functions more like a fantasy. And I think that this is true on several levels. I think that as an individual person suffering or experiencing some kind of thing that you would want to heal from, the healing that you are reaching for often doesn't really happen in the way that you would imagine it would. It's kept from you in many ways, either from inaccessible conditions, no access to healthcare or whatever, but also psychological healing, spiritual healing, I think, gets sort of dangled in front of us as this thing that we can hope for. But it often doesn't come. And when it does, it's not this thing that, where you're reborn into this pure newness and you don't have any pain anymore. I think that healing just kind of, I think it can be a distraction, actually, from the work that needs to be done and that constantly needs to be done. Like it kind of strikes me as this kind of similar move of, like lists of anti-racism books that go around, and it's like, oh, we just need to read these and then you'll be good. Like, I just like there's some part of me that I'm like, yeah, but what about tomorrow? And the day after that, and the day after that, like we have work to do that's going to take forever. And there isn't this kind of achievement or success that will happen and then everything is fine. So I feel like healing in many ways kind of gets tangled up in a narrative like that, and I find that to be a distraction at least,
Are there other terms that are closer to you? I know we spoke before about the idea of coping.
I like coping. I used to like coping a lot more than I do now. I think that disabled folks get a bit tired of hearing the word coping and how they need to just foster resilience. It's like, what do you think I'm fucking doing, Like, like I'm really good at the resilience part. I would like maybe to not have to be so resilient all the time. I think this is a very common feeling, not just in the disabled community, but in any marginalized, any oppressed group. It's like coping, resilience, still showing up, still putting in the work. Like, that's just a daily default position that we have to do. I think that with COVID, this kind of shifted into a bigger scale. I think that some groups in the world that maybe have never thought about things like ableism before or disability before suddenly had to think about them. A friend of mine said when COVID landed that the world was just going to get a little more crip. And I think that did happen on some level. Like, one thing I really enjoyed was how everyone asked each other how they were a lot more. That seemed like a nice kind of weird result of the pandemic, is that this sort of assumption that things were really hard and that just like getting out of bed in the morning and like persisting in this society is like a struggle. Like, it seemed like people kind of all felt that in a really deep way, and not just like those of us who feel it all the time. Like, it felt like it was being talked about in a bigger way. I don't know, I guess like one of my things about care is that it's often thought of or framed in these kind of very nice, gentle terms. Like, care is like someone bringing you chicken soup when you're sick. And I'm like, I don't know, like, it seems to me that on an institutional level, care is often leveraged in a very violent way. It's a very kind of like policing, surveillance kind of thing. Also, just, this maybe is like just from my own personal vibe, but like I feel like being crip is fucking metal, It's like diarrhea, bleeding, like, really intense things about the body that are kind of foregrounded in your relationships. This is what access intimacy is about. It's about being like, oh yeah, like I'm dragging this pile of bones around and it's hard, miserable, painful.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of resonance with that. I saw a lot of people writing questions. If the questions could maybe
Oh yeah, please send up the questions.
could maybe be gathered at this point.
I wanted to say too that I understand that asking questions or comments like in a forum like this might not be for everyone. So if anybody has like a personal specific question they want to ask me, I'll hang around afterward and you can ask me just one-on-one rather than like broadcasting your pain to the room. I'll hang out for a few minutes afterward if anybody wants to talk then.
And the other thing that I really liked is the idea that you address this almost platitude that people say when you've gone through something awful, when you've had experienced something traumatic, you've maybe had something going on with your body, your psyche, people, or even just maybe a very important relationship has ended, and that's been incredibly painful. People come out with this platitude, time is a great healer, time heals everything, just take some time. And you leverage great umbrage with this idea. And yeah,
I just don't think it's true. I don't think that time heals all wounds. I think that's bullshit. I mean, it's just bullshit. And it also, like, seems to me to rely on a concept of time that is a capitalist kind of linear kind of time. It's time without quality. It's time only as quantity. Like, if you can measure time only in terms of quantity, then you can mine it without compunction, right? 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, whatever. But if you have time with a quality to it, like, I need to rest right now. Night is different than day. There's a quality to, like, the time in the winter versus the time in the summer. There's a quality to the time after a big project versus before. Just the qualities of time and the cyclical nature of it, the kind of non-linearity, the way that time disrupts, right? Like, the way that time disrupts linearity. I feel like this is something that is kind of all wrapped up when you're talking about healing, is you need to kind of make space and make room for the fact that time doesn't just march forward in a linear way and can only be counted. You know, there are other ways of measuring time and feeling it in our bodies. So yeah, I don't take much comfort from time heals all wounds. I just sound so cranky today. I'm just like really pissed off.
yeah, I think it's completely necessary. I think we've got a question approaching.
Questions?
Thank you, Amelie. Okay, so this talk was brilliant. Thank you for reading a much needed text that contains the full range of human emotions. Thank you for sharing your time, your thoughtfulness. Rock on. No question.
Oh, thank you.
A question that I'd like to ask is this idea that you addressed of failing and language failing. And I know we're both great fans of the writer Janice Lee. And Janice Lee's amazing book, if you haven't read it yet, Imagine a Death. It's phenomenal. And she talks about the fact that language is constantly failing, and that is why we write.
Yes.
And I wanted to just ask about, for you, your practice as an artist, as a musician, as a writer, what writing means for you, and how writing is perhaps part of your practice of resistance.
That's nice. Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite quotes, I think, is a Sontag quote. She said, writing is the hardest thing in the world, and it's hardest of all for writers. I really agree. I feel like I sit down in my office every morning, and I write 500 words a day. Before I eat, before I speak, before I really do anything. I've been doing that for 20 years. And whenever I'm doing that, I feel like I'm in this kind of like a tempest of humiliation at how I keep not finding the right word. Like, that's what it is. It's just like, nope, that's not the right word yet. Okay, try another one. Nope. And, you know, you just have to kind of like push into that space. And actually, like, I find that when I can be in that space with curiosity, like generally if I'm making something and I feel like my curiosity is driving the car rather than like my expertise or something, I feel much better about it. It's just more fun. And I know fun is like a thing that seems frivolous, but it's actually really important to try to cultivate more and more, especially if you're an artist who's, you know, living below the poverty line. It's like, what else have you got? But, you know, oh, look at this Saurus.com thing. This is a cool synonym. You know, like you get these like small pleasures in your craft. So I think like there's something to me about language that I'm excited about when it can take a different body or a different form. It's not just words on a page, but you know, playing music or something, like this is a kind of language that lives in my body that I can play an instrument, you know, and it expresses itself in a different form. Or the term body like comes up to me a lot with language because I feel like, yeah, like writing is language embodied, and the body can take so many different forms. It's not just this thing, you know. So it's exciting to me to think about it like that.
I think that's the perfect moment to say thank you for sharing so generously. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to be in exchange and enrage with you for the next year. I'd like to invite you all to exit using the south entry. As Johanna mentioned, if there's a question you'd rather ask personally, they're open for that. Will you join me in just showing our appreciation for Johanna?
Thank you,
Hedler, please?
everybody,
Thank
for
you.
coming out and sitting here. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me, too.
Thank you.